right, so in the last lesson we looked at the third and fourth appearances of Jesus post-resurrection, this 40-day period of appearances, according to Acts 1, verse 3. First to the one that was mentioned in about Peter that we don't have any record of, except for that it happened. And then to the two disciples who were traveling to Emmaus from Jerusalem, who didn't recognize Jesus until after he sat down at the table with them, and then all of a sudden they recognized him, and then he suddenly disappeared again. And they quickly ran back to Jerusalem to tell the disciples what they had seen. That's what we talked about Wednesday night. And even now, the apostles still struggled to believe. They still were struggling with their belief, as we're going to see in this lesson. And we may wonder ourselves, how do we know? How did they know? How do we know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Jesus is alive? How did they know at that time that he was alive? And yet, it may sound like an easy question, but it's also not quite so simple to answer. We may struggle with doubts, like they struggled with doubts, and we'll see that as well in this lesson. The importance of faith, the kind of faith that we have, strength of it, and the importance of it. So the fifth and sixth appearances is what we're going to be looking at, which comes from, like I said, Luke 24. Let's see, 36 through 43, John 20, 19 through 25, and then one mention of it in Mark 16. We'll probably start by reading Mark 16, 14. It's just a one verse little mention of it. It says, "Afterward he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at table, and he rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen." So we've seen in these first four instances so far that every time somebody came to tell them, it was met with, if not unbelief, disbelief. And in this case, the text explicitly says, he rebuked them for their unbelief, because they had not believed the people who were telling them, we saw Jesus, or this happened and this is what we saw. So the more detailed account is in Luke 24 and John 20, and this is what Luke records here. Luke 24:36 says, "As they were talking about these things," this is leading directly after what we saw Wednesday night, after the two disciples came back and told them what had happened. "As they were talking about these things, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, 'Peace to you.' But they were startled and frightened and thought they saw a spirit. And he said to them, 'Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have.' And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still disbelieved for joy and were marveling, he said to them, 'Have you anything here to eat?' They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate before them." All right, we'll look at John's account real quick before we go any farther there. John 20, verse 19 says, "On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said to them, 'Peace be with you.' When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, 'Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you.' And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, 'Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you withhold forgiveness from any, it is withheld.'" We'll stop there for now. So we saw the disciples' unbelief. Date and the time, we don't know any more than what we're told, which, thanks to John, says it was the first day of the week. So we're still on the first day of the week. Or maybe we're on a different first day of the week, but it was the first day of the week. We don't know which first day of the week. I guess there's a 1 in 4 chance, or 3 or 4. I guess 4, depending on where you start. That's what it was. As far as the location, though, we have no idea. By the way, this is a verse that would support the idea that John used the Roman time. The others seem to have used the Jewish time, which is sundown to sundown. That was their day. So the day start, it seems totally crazy to us. Why in the world would the day start at sundown? That makes no sense. And I'm sure the Roman way didn't make any sense to the Jews. But it's generally believed that John wrote quite a bit after the other three, and that he was used, any time references in his gospel account were the Roman time. And this verse would indicate that, and it's what we would call Sunday night. The Jews would have called this Monday morning, I guess, or Monday. It would have been Monday to them if it was Sunday night, but he says it was the evening of that day. Yep. Okay. Evening and morning. Well, there's still evening and morning in our days. But each day he said. Yeah, I get it. I get your point. Yeah. Evening and then morning. Yeah. Fair point. Yeah. At any rate, midnight being the start of the day doesn't make any sense either. So what would make most sense is sunrise would be when you would consider the start of the day, it seems to me anyway, since that is literally the start of the daytime. So sundown to sundown or midnight to midnight, neither one of them makes perfect sense. But they have their reasons, I guess. I've never looked into the history of why the midnight thing started, but apparently that's how the Romans, even back then, viewed it, and we adopted from them. We don't know where they were at this time, other than it seems that they were still hanging around in the region of Judea. What we do know is that wherever they were in somebody's house, and whichever house it was, they had the doors shut and the doors locked because of a fear of the Jews. So we don't know where this house was specifically, but wherever they were well secured inside and locked the doors, which ends up being a kind of significant detail that seems like something you could read right over, becomes kind of important, or at least significant, whenever Jesus shows up, or anybody else would have showed up for that matter, which is what happened next. Jesus appears. Going back to Luke's account, and again, we pointed out Wednesday night, just so matter of fact is the record of it. There's no fancy language. There's no dramatic, kinds of ways that we might express things like behold, and the Bible does that a lot, but in this case, it doesn't. It just says Jesus was there. Just like you might say Uncle Tom was there or something, Paul came over or something like that. It's just as matter of fact as it can be. Jesus himself stood among them, Luke 24:36, and said to them, "Peace be with you," or "Peace to you." But they were scared, and who can blame them? He wasn't there before. He's there now. The doors were locked. Wouldn't you be scared? At least for a second. But the reason they were scared was not so much because, like startled immediately when somebody shows up, but they thought it was a spirit, not a person. In other words, some versions might say a ghost or something along those lines, maybe. I'm not sure. But that's kind of the idea. You thought you might have seen a ghost. You look like you've seen a ghost. They thought they were looking at a ghost. This isn't the first time that's happened, is it? There was another time when they saw Jesus and they thought it was a spirit. When he was on the water, and again, who can blame them? People don't walk on water. The only thing that can be is a spirit. And Jesus quickly soothed them and told them, don't worry, it's just me. Well, that's very similar to what he's going to do here. They thought they saw a spirit. Now, I would consider that to be a significant statement, as we'll see as this unfolds. He says, why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? About who he was, obviously, or whether it was really him. See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. So this is Jesus trying to convince them or prove to them that he was not a spirit. Now, in the immediate context, that's just pretty straightforward. However, there would be those, and I guess still are those perhaps, who claimed that Jesus didn't really come in the flesh at all, but he just appeared like that, and therefore he didn't really die because he didn't really have a body, and therefore in some way or another he was always just like a spirit. But Jesus here proves that wrong as well, because he says, his whole point in verse 39 is, I'm not a spirit. I'm not just a spirit that looks like Jesus. I'm not in a spirit form. I'm me. He says, see my hands and my feet, touch me and see, because a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones. But I do. I have flesh and bones right now, as you can see. That's what he's telling them. And he says, I'll prove it to you. Look, and you can touch me, and you'll see. I don't know what if he was a spirit? Would you be able to touch him, or would your hand go right through, like in a movie about, Casper the Friendly Ghost or something? It just goes right through. Well, Jesus says, you can touch me and see. And if they did, and I think it's probably they did, like Thomas would want to do, which we'll see in the next one, it would have felt just like if you touched somebody. You know why? Because that's what Jesus was a somebody. He was dead. The same body that hung on the cross is now standing in the room with them. That's the whole significance of the resurrection of Christ, is that he actually rose from the dead. His body, not just his spirit went to paradise, but his body was in the tomb, but then reunited and left. Now he's in the room with them. And they thought naturally, I guess we would say naturally, they saw a ghost, he said, or a spirit. Not a spirit. I have flesh and bones. Showed them his hands and his feet. Verse 40. They still disbelieved. But it was different now, wasn't it? Before, they struggled with unbelief, and I made that distinction a few minutes ago. Now they disbelieved. Why? They disbelieved, verse 41, for joy. Now that's a little different, isn't it? I can't believe this because I'm so happy. This is incredible. It's not like, I don't believe you. I don't believe you when you say you saw Jesus. I don't believe you. Now, they're seeing Jesus, but it's a different kind of doubt, if you want to call it doubt. It's more like, can this really be? It's more like, I don't understand what's going on. I'm very pleased with it. I don't get it. And my mind can't even process this. That's the kind of disbelief they were struggling with now. And that's thanks to Jesus, because, turning from unbelief to disbelief is still a step in the right direction. And before long, they would take another step in the right direction. But as if that wasn't enough proof, so he says, look at me. Look at my hands and my feet. Spirit doesn't have flesh and bones like I have. It's I myself. And as if that wasn't enough, he says, you got anything to eat? They gave him a piece of fish. And he took it. Luke says in verse 43, he took it and he ate before them. That's all part of the proof, apparently, of that he's not a spirit. He ate food. Now, I'm no spirit on expert, or I'm no expert on spirits. I'm no expert on talking either, apparently. I'm no expert on spirits. Apparently, they don't eat. I have seen the movie Casper the Friendly Ghost back in the 90s. I used to have it, watched it all the time. They tried to eat, and the food went down to the floor. I saw it happen 100,000 times when I was a kid. Apparently, I don't know how that relates to real life, but the fact that Jesus took the food and he ate it was even further proof that he was not a spirit. He was himself. And I'll also add, this is the only time, to my knowledge, that we see him eating after his resurrection. We saw, as we pointed out in John 21 earlier this morning, that he took some food and he gave it to them. He fixed it for them, but there's no record of him eating it. It seems he had no need to eat, but he could eat. He proved it. He used that to prove to them that he was himself. Those were his words. See that it is I myself. Same Lord that you have been with all this time, I'm still him. That's still me. And then he anticipates the Great Commission when he says, in John's account, that is, he goes on in Luke's account too, but in John's account he says, as the Father sent me, even so I'm sending you. And then he, I guess in sort of a gesture, he breathed on them, and he said, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven. If you withhold forgiveness from any, it's withheld. We shouldn't get carried away with that. He's not saying that the apostles were able to arbitrarily decide who gets to be forgiven and who doesn't. But the purpose of their teaching would be the forgiveness of sins, and according to God's standard, obviously, sins will be forgiven or withheld. And that's what the apostles would be presenting. It had nothing to do with their own personal thought or anything like that. They were presenting God's word. It would come from them, physically, from their mouths, but it didn't come from within themselves. They were given it from the Holy Spirit, obviously. So that's anticipating the Great Commission. He wasn't given the Great Commission here, but it's certainly pointing to it, which is pretty clear. As the Father sent me, I'm sending you, which he was going to do soon. But in the next couple verses in John's account, we're told that Thomas, one of the 12, wasn't with them. He was absent. Where was he? I don't know. Maybe he ran to the store. Maybe Peter and John told him to go get some bread and milk or something. I don't know where he was. I just know he wasn't there. And so when he got back, now we're seeing some getting deja vu, because now they tell Thomas, we saw the Lord. He was here. And Thomas said, in so many words, I don't believe you. Surprise, surprise, here we go again. In fact, he said it even more strongly than that. He said, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. You can tell me the story all day long. Until I see it, I'll never believe. That's pretty strong. Well, little did he know that was going to change. I mean, that wasn't going to change, but his belief was going to change because he was going to actually see Jesus. So The sixth appearance is very similar to the fifth. The only difference is now Thomas is there. So, going on down in John chapter 20, verse 26, 8 days later, so Thomas is going to have to wait a whole week, a little more than a week. They were inside again, but now Thomas is there. And it says, although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, he said, "Put your finger here. See my hands." And put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. So Jesus clearly knew what Thomas had said before. And now he's saying, here's your proof. Go on with what you said. You said until you see and place your hand, well, here, do it. Thomas answered, "My Lord and my God." Did he actually put his finger in the hole? Oh, I don't know. Maybe he didn't take that much after all. Maybe seeing was enough, because all we read is that he answered, "My Lord and my God." So Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Now that statement should be an encouragement to us, I guess, but it was also clearly meant to be a gentle rebuke of Thomas. Because well, yeah, they didn't believe when other people saw. They didn't believe. It applies to the others just as much as Thomas. The only difference is it took Thomas 6 appearances of Jesus total, and they believed in 5 because they happened to be involved in the 5th one, as far as the way we're counting. But they didn't believe when other people saw and told them, just like Thomas didn't believe when they saw and told him. So it applies to them as much as it did to him. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe anyway. Now that statement wouldn't be necessarily true about everything, that you should believe things even though you've never seen them. But in terms of them and him, they should have believed because the people that they knew and loved and should have trusted and probably did trust and they knew were reliable, told them, "We saw him. He appeared. He said this, or he did this, or the angel said this," and they didn't believe. Now, if you remember at the very beginning, John and Peter didn't even believe the women when they said the tomb was empty. They didn't even believe that. So they ran, took off, and they found it just like the women said. But then when the women said, "We saw Jesus," they didn't believe. They still didn't believe that. And then again and again and again. Now finally, he appears to them. They believe now, after Jesus proved to them that he wasn't a ghost or a spirit. Thomas said, "I'll never believe unless I see it myself." Well, he saw it himself, and to his credit, he did believe now. But Jesus says, it would have been better if you believed it before you even saw. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Now, we can believe the credible testimony of these witnesses in the same way that Thomas could have believed the credible testimony of those witnesses. Because one of those 12 or 11, I guess 10 in this case, witnesses was John himself, who wrote this. And John has written it down, and one of the same men that told Thomas about it has written it down and told us about it. So, even though we're farther removed from the whole scene, the evidence is still there for us to either choose to believe it or not. And the evidence would suggest that we should believe it. There's no reason to doubt. And anybody that says there's a reason to doubt is either blind or inconsistent. Because, like we've pointed out in our last few lessons. The same people that would say there's no reason to believe what the Bible says wouldn't have any problem believing some book that they found that said something else that they want to believe. If they found an old book that says God doesn't exist, they'd believe that, even if there was nothing but that written on a scrap of paper. God is not real. The earth evolved over billions of years. They believe that. Put it in a museum somewhere. See, look, we found the proof. When, some random hillbilly could have written that down and dug it in the dirt and buried it a decade ago. But they wouldn't question that. Of course, that's an exaggeration. But still, what does the evidence suggest? There still has yet to be a logical explanation for any of this that's happened. But we do have an explanation in the Scriptures. And it is not far-fetched, even if it may be difficult for somebody to believe, but it's not any more difficult than alternatives. The question is, what do we want to believe? So, seeing is believing, we say. Yeah. It seemed like Jesus struggled the same way to understand what was holding them up, because that's why he said, why do you doubt? What? Do you not know me? Look at what you've seen me do. And are you really that surprised that I've done what I told you I was going to do? I think that was the main thing was, Yeah. Sometimes we just really make things harder for ourselves than they have to be. And I guess our biggest stumbling block is sometimes ourselves. And yeah. And we can come up with things, not consciously, but we cause ourselves to fall short, I guess, in our understanding sometimes, or grasping of something. But the biggest thing was Jesus told them exactly what he was going to do. Go to Jerusalem. Chief priests and elders are going to seize me. I'm going to be delivered up. They're going to crucify me, and I'm going to rise on the third day. And every single one of those things starts happening. Remember, their initial reaction was, no way. None of that's happening to you, and I'll prove it. And he got his tail between his legs real quick after that. But then, here it goes. It's happening. Delivered up, betrayed. Now he's being crucified. And yet, it's like, okay, he's been delivered up, but the rest ain't going to happen. Well, now he's been tried and convicted. But the rest he's still not going to be crucified. Now he's getting nailed to the cross. Well, okay, he's still not going to die. Somebody's going to save him. Then he dies. And it's like it just keeps, and yet they still almost are like, well, he's dead. That's it. That's the end. And then they find out the tomb's empty. And instead of being like, wow, it's really happened, they think. They took him somewhere, and we don't know where they took him. And then the women say they saw him. Well, he's not alive. He's dead. We know he's dead. We watched him die. And now, finally, hopefully, this is the last thing it took. Why do you doubt? Look at me. You know what the odds are of 10 men having the same exact vision at the exact same time would be if it was a hallucination? I don't know what it would be, except 0%. 0% chance of that ever happening. But he was standing right there, and he says, look at me. You can see that it's me. I'm not just some kind of phantom. It's me. Look, remember these? Here they are. Flesh and bones. Joe?
That's the same thing that trips us up. And it is the greatest, I think, of all mysteries. And the reason we know been given, the treasure has been given to men. I mean, you know, they all saw him die, and they heard them say, well, he saved others, why can't he save himself? And you hear all these things, and that's how they tore the Bible down to many Christians, is men wrote this. Men are fallible. So if they are fallible, how could they carry the truth of God in them?
Mhm.
I mean, that's how they tore the Bible down to many Christians on the campus and whatever. Why do you trust these men? Why do you trust? And we just sang, and because you believe, others will know that I live.
Yeah.
It's the only way they're going to know.
As long as, I mean, people believing doesn't necessarily make somebody else believe, but it does make a difference. I guess the reverse of that is easier to see. If nobody believed it, what are the odds of some new person coming to believe it? The odds are very, I mean, the fewer people that actually believe it, the odds become lower and lower that somebody else would believe it.
But the fact that all of these disciples died and would not, could not, I mean, say that it was not true. So it does help
Yeah.
me to know.
But also, every bit of information or anything anybody believes on this earth comes from men. Like every textbook, anything anybody believes comes from,
Yeah.
you know, so it's like,
So it's not just a case of men are fallible, and therefore you shouldn't trust that. Those people would say, those men are fallible. You shouldn't believe those people. Now, these men that say what we believe, you can trust what they say. Well, why? Why doesn't it work the same way? If there's a chance that these men were wrong, why isn't there a chance that your men are wrong? But no, we don't go there. They have science when they don't really have science. They have the thing that they call science.
The word we trust in. I mean, we listen, but whatever you say, we have to go in here to see if the word matches. If the treasure is not us,
Yeah.
it is the word that dwells in us.
And that goes with any written thing. Every single recorded thing that is supposedly true, you choose whether you believe it or not. Everything. Now, you may not be interested in it, but you still choose whether or not you're going to believe that that thing actually happened. So whether it's a tale from history, like ancient history that the Romans did this or did that, or you know, the British did this or did that, or this happened under Hitler's reign or regime, or any of this, anything either happened or it didn't. And you choose whether or not you think it actually happened. The problem that people may not think about is whenever somebody might charge against the Bible, but that stuff can't happen. So a man can't rise from the dead. So he either didn't really die or he didn't rise from the dead. If he was alive, he was alive all along. If he died, he was not alive again, because that doesn't happen. And as I pointed out, the problem with that is, in evolution and that whole thought, they say the same thing about that, and they believe it anyway. Yeah, that can't happen, but it did happen. Well, why can't you say that about a miracle? Miracles don't happen, but they did happen. Why not? Why can't that be true? If that can be true, why can't it be true with this? Well, because I don't want it to be true. I don't choose to accept that it happened.
it would be hard though to try to like remedy that if you're in a conversation with someone and they're saying, okay, well I'll give you this, evolution's impossible, sounds like it's impossible. So, but then this is also impossible too. So neither one is true. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but that can't be. One of them has to be true. That's why and the resurrection of Jesus is such an important thing that it does lead right back to creation and the origin of man. If, just like Paul said, if Christ was not raised, if the dead aren't raised, Christ wasn't raised, and if Christ wasn't raised, then we're in a whole heap of trouble. Our faith is in vain. Our preaching is in vain. Everything. And that goes back to God's existence at all. Ultimately, because they're so wrapped up in one another. Well, the reason that the creation and evolution debate is so important is because one of them has to be true. And I don't know of anybody that denies that on either side. One of them has to be true. And that's why so many cling so strongly to evolution, is because they know it's the only other alternative. It's the only thing that they have. And it's changed so much over the years, and more time just gets tacked onto it, because time is the secret to everything, and if given enough time, anything is possible pretty much, except miracles, of course. But time can take care of it if you have enough of it. All this stuff can happen. So even though it can't happen, doesn't happen, it did happen, because we're here. That's the argument. But that same thing they could apply to the things that they reject. They don't happen, but it did happen. Divine beings aren't just going around creating universes all over the place all the time, but it did happen, and the Bible records it. And the thing is, the same man who recorded that God did that recorded things that he had no way to know of his own. Things that man did not discover until not very long before our lifetime. But Moses knew it. Now, how did Moses know something that man didn't know until 200 years ago? Somebody's got to explain that. I can explain it. But those who refuse to believe in the divine origin of the Bible can't explain it, because there's no explanation. Moses got lucky? I mean, he just totally winged it and it happened to be true? No way. Mm-hmm.
It is difficult to wrap your mind around how such a powerful, perfect God could dwell.
With man?
Yeah, when he was talking of, well, no, me. I mean, it's kind of like David. Our sins are always before us. We are weak. We are people who don't deserve. And yet, God, I mean, Emmanuel, God with us and walking with us. It's kind of like when you want to know if you're going to know people in heaven or whatever. I thought, if I know me, I'll know you easily, because I can't imagine myself sinless. I mean, that's why the table is so important. It's like, please continually cleanse me. Please, make me white as snow. It's hard, because
That's what's so special about it, and powerful, is that when we have a proper appreciation for how undeserving we really are, and yet this has been offered to us, that should move us. It should mean something. Just like if some big and powerful, famous person did something for me personally, that would change my life, and there would probably not be a day go by that I didn't think about that person, and the fact that all that happened. Like, how is that possible that person did that, or offered that to me, or cared enough for me, and just multiply that by a million or infinity when we're talking about the creator of the universe. Offers something for me that nobody else can, and that I never could possibly deserve, but he does offer it. It's the same thing when Paul said he's actually not that far from us. He's near to all of us. He's not far from any of us. He wants us to feel after him and find him, but he's not far. He's not even that far away. If we want to find him, and that's the key. And it's not that hard.
if we don't accept it, we
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's essentially what we do. We think, well, I'm not good enough, or I can't do this,
Yeah.
whatever. It's like we're calling him.
I'm not worthy, and therefore it won't work for me.
Exactly.
I mean, the I'm not worthy part is true, but whenever you take that to the application of it won't work, even if I tried, even if I wanted it to, then you're calling God a liar or powerless, which also calls him a liar, you know. So, yeah, it's a matter of accepting Jesus, which means accepting his everything about Jesus, his resurrection, that he died for the sins of the world. Just like John said, I guess just as a matter of closing, we ask the question, if we haven't seen Jesus, anybody here seen Jesus? No, just shake your head. How can you believe in him? You've never seen him. Well, we won't get into the whole, there's lots of things that people have never seen that they believe in, like we just talked about a second ago. Well, John answers the question in John, in this chapter, right there at the end. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Once again, just as matter of fact as it can be, John says, I have written these things down. If you saw something happen that you knew that people would have trouble believing, what would you do? You'd probably want to tell people. You'd probably write it down. Maybe you're about to, your life's almost over. You write it. I want people to know that this happened. And I'll tell you the things that Jesus did, or this happened, and I want you to know that it happened. I wrote these things down so that you would believe that these things happened. That's what John has done here. These things were written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And then John wasn't going to, worry himself to death whether people would believe it or not. He wanted people to believe it. But what could John do more than he did? He wrote it down, said this happened. Now do with it what you will. But he said, I wrote it so that you would believe. So these things were written for that specific purpose. We can believe what John said the same way that we could believe what Charles Darwin said or what anybody said. The difference is what John said and the other Bible writers bears the marks of something more than man, something bigger than just from man in general. It bears the marks of coming from God himself. And maybe that will be a good study for us sometime in the near future of why exactly is the Bible so different than anything else. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. They still were struggling. And they would get it, especially when the Holy Spirit came, then it would all sort of fall into place. But even now, because they had struggled so much they had to be untaught first. That's the issue we run into sometimes. You can either try to convert somebody that's never been taught, or you have to unteach them first. They had to be untaught, So that's why they had so much trouble understanding the Scriptures, is because they already had been taught wrongly. So they had to be untaught. And Jesus, he didn't even try to unteach them, really. He just taught them, and then all that unteaching part, he left that for later. He said, Spirit, I'll let you handle that part. You mess with that. I'm just going to teach them. So yeah, they still struggle with the Scriptures, but they would get it eventually, and we have an advantage. Hopefully, we have an advantage over them in that department at least. But many people today do not have that advantage. Did somebody else have something? I saw that hand again. I saw a hand. Yeah. It can't do it. We can recreate. And that sort of begs the question, how was it instilled in humans or any living creature the ability to even do that? Procreate. But creating life, man's never been out. They've tried, like John said. They've been trying. Never done it. Never will. And they've also never come across anything that has any new genetic makeup. Even there's a thing that is called sometimes microevolution, which is true. It is an actual thing. It's probably not the best name for it, but it's like, yeah, viruses, they change, caterpillar, butterfly type thing. These kinds of things happen, but it's still the same genetic code, the same DNA, the same genetic makeup. It never changes. And man's never been able to create new. I don't know how that works. It's, mind-boggling to me in itself. But the genetic makeup of everything in the universe has already been, it was created, it was done when Moses said it was done, and God said it's, okay, that's it. That was it. Other than spirits, I guess you could say, each individual person has their own spirit. So as long as people are being born, that's going to happen. But physical things, never again. And man, the longer time goes on, ironically, man has more reason to believe in the truth instead of their alternatives. And yet, the more time goes on, man tries to come up with new ways to avoid accepting the truth. Joe, I hesitate to say I'll give you the last word, but
But it's kind of like you err because you don't know, or basically you don't remember the power of God. And I think, it's like, well, he took care of David and he took care of so-and-so and he took, in the Bible, but he's not going to take care of me. I'm just little old me and I was born this way, The poor me stuff gets in the way of the power. Like David, it's kind of like, well, he took care of the bear, he took care of the lion. If he wants me to take care of the giant, I can do that too. That's the way we should look at things. It's not us, it's him and his power. And the power's in the Word. All I have to do is get me out of the way and give
yeah,
the Word.
just do what he said. And that goes back to comparing, I think. We compare ourselves to people like David. And, okay, so God helped him do this, and he helped him take down Goliath. Well, would God help me if I wanted to go do this thing? If I wanted to go fight a bear or a lion or something, would God be with me and help me kill that lion or bear? Probably not. So, therefore, what's the point? When instead we should just think, don't even worry about that. Don't ask, will God do this if I do that? Just do what God said to do. And he said that he'll help you. I don't have to understand how he'll help me. Just like David probably didn't understand exactly how God would help him in the moment. We're looking at it from here and reading about it way after the fact. And sometimes we take for granted that David knew everything that we look at after the fact. He probably had no clue. He knew that God would help him. That's all. That's pretty much it. Yeah. All along. And if we'll just do what God, that goes back to this morning with Peter, and Jesus said, don't worry about him. If I want him to do this, what's that to you? You just do what I said. And the end. Keep doing that. And that's all you got to worry about. So God's made it pretty simple for us. We're the ones that complicate it to no end. Just what has God said for me to do? I'm going to do that and put the rest in his hands. And it starts with believing in general. Believing him, believing in him, believing what he has said to the point of doing it.